Good morning and evening, everyone. My name is Nick Croggan, and I'm the Public Programs Officer at the Power Institute. If you haven't come across the Power Institute before, we are a foundation based at the University of Sydney, focused on art and visual culture. We publish books, we coordinate residencies and other support for researchers, and we also organise public programs like today's. The Power Institute is located on the beautiful land of the Gadi people of the Eora Nation. And I'm joining you today from the country of the Wadawurrung and Djajawarrung people. And I pay my respects to these sovereign Indigenous owners of the lands on which I'm visiting and on which the Power Institute is located. And while our event is online today, I think it's important to recall, especially for people of settler heritage like myself, of the Indigenous sovereignty that sustains the country on which our seemingly invisible virtual networks move with such ease. Today's lecture is the first in a series of public talks entitled Image Complex, which the Power Institute is co-presenting this year with the Museum of Contemporary Art Australia. The term image complex was coined by the US activists and scholars Yates McKee and Meg McGlagan to describe the infrastructure that produces and maintains the dominant ways of making and seeing images that shape life in the early 21st century. The image complex is not just one place or thing, but rather an always shifting network of people, institutions, technologies, and platforms. At stake in the image complex is thus not just the content of what we see, but rather what is seeable and the significance ascribed to that seeability. Image complex points to a longer history of vision, understood not as something universal, unchanging, or natural, but rather as a product of distinct historical and political forces. Over the course of this year, both online and in person, we will hear from 4 leading international scholars who will help us understand the contours and longer histories of the image complex. Nick Mirzoeff, Orit Halpern, Krista Thompson, and Jack Halberstam. These thinkers offer important new ways of thinking about art and visuality, one that centers histories of science and technology, colonial histories, queer and trans life worlds, and radical Black aesthetics. These thinkers and perspectives also allow us to see our contemporary image complex not as an immovable machine, but rather as a complex and unstable assemblage, vulnerable at all moments to rupture by alternative histories and possible futures. There are few people in the world more qualified to lead a discussion about the image complex than our first speaker in 2023 for the Image Complex series, Nick Mirzoeff. Nick is a scholar, a critic, and a visual activist who over the past 30 years has profoundly shaped the way that we think and talk about contemporary visual culture. He's currently a professor of media, culture, and communications at New York University. And his most recent book, which I think he will be touching on today, is entitled White Sight: Visual Politics and Practices of Whiteness. We're going to begin today with a short conversation about the broader shape of Nick's work before I will hand across to Nick for his lecture. And we'll have the opportunity after his talk for some questions. So I encourage you to put those in the Q&A function in Zoom as we go. But first, thank you so much, Nick, for joining us and welcome.
It's very nice to be here. It's odd to be talking to tomorrow, but that's all part of the global cultures in which we live, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And thank you for joining us in the evening, because I know it's getting late there. I thought I might begin by asking you to tell us a bit about where you're speaking from in the program in particular that you are part of at NYU Steinhardt, which is a sort of a relatively unique program that you're teaching in.
Media, culture, and communication is a huge department. We have 1,000 undergraduate students. We have about 120 MAs and 50 or 60 PhD students. The way I think of it now is that it's not so much tied to objects as tied to sets of practices. And media is what we do in media culture and communications, where we put it. So we have all kinds of folks. We have anthropologists, we have musicologists, we have a substantial number of visual culture people, queer and trans studies scholars, Black studies scholars, and creating then a kind of network around the department for thinking about this enormously expansive field of contemporary communications and media.
And it's interesting because it is so much more expansive, I guess, than where you began your academic career, which was in the field of art history in the 1980s. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what the field of art history was like in the 1980s and what the kind of stakes were as you encountered it.
I mean, that's an interesting question, and reflected on that for a while. But if you think back as far as the 1980s, one of the reasons that I was involved and interested in working in art history was that was one of the places in the humanities at that time that you could study Marxism through the work of P.J. Clarke, for example. You could study feminism through the work of people like Griselda Pollock. And it really felt like this was a place where you could do something very different. The journal Block, which began in London in around 1980, I think. There was the first visual culture publication out of Middlesex, it was then Middlesex Polytechnic. It seemed like an awful lot was happening. It seemed very dynamic. There was a range of excitement around the incorporation of what was then simply called theory, which meant everything that had come out of continental Europe since the upheavals of 1968. That got labeled post-structuralism subsequently. Edward Said came and keynoted one of the early art history conferences that I went to as a graduate student, although I have to say it was not one of Said's better lectures. He talked endlessly about Aida, which was okay. It was okay. And then, a series of unexpected consequences followed from this. I think that's one of the reasons that people started approaching an area that subsequently become called visual culture or whatever else one wants to call it. And then the core of the discipline, as it believed itself to be a sort of modernist, museum-oriented, masterpiece-centered group of scholars and institutions, pushed back very hard against that. And they felt that this was something that needed to be almost sort of eradicated. And it was a similar sort of mistake in a way that English departments made in relation to cultural studies a little bit earlier. And I think what we see with both those fields is that now we're in a very dynamic state where there are very interactive, critical programs thinking intersectionally, and sort of the discipline-based humanities, at least in the United States. I'm not familiar, obviously, with how things are in Australia now, but English is very much a quieter field than it was, and art history is shrinking institutionally and in terms of resources, partly because I think they took this very defensive position. So it's interesting to see the unfolding over time. So ironically, I mean, I think it was a very dynamic and exciting field 40 years ago in a way that perhaps less so now. But becoming, I think, my own work is sort of intersecting again with contemporary art, which has always been central to my interests and concerns. And so in my own program, for example, we have a range of scholars and students working on contemporary art, because here we're not tied to problems like, the question of the canon or the question of identifying trends or those kinds of things that are still seem to be central in some parts of art history. I know that's not true at all at the Power.
Certainly, and the Power Institute is its full title, of course, is the Power Institute, the Foundation for Art and Visual Culture, and visual culture is a field that I know that you've spent your life explaining what it is to people in interviews just like this, so I'll spare you that question. But I did want to ask you, because especially in the 1990s. It was an emergent field of study and one that you led the development of. And so I wanted to ask in particular, what was at stake in the word culture in visual culture? What is the culture that you were speaking of specifically in the 1990s?
I think that was endlessly discussed at the time. And I think there are 2 points to make here. One is essentially, I think what we were trying to do was to think in relation to British cultural studies. Certainly that's what I was trying to do. That there was an attempt then to make an intersection between the work in contemporary art and art history with the practice of British cultural studies. So around the time that I myself brought out the first visual culture reader, Stuart Hall and Jessica Evans brought out a visual culture reader also that was more derived from cultural studies work, and that seemed like a natural convergence. And Stuart, who was a mentor to me back in the day, then went on to set up the International Visual Arts Association, INVA, and to help mentor Autograph Black Photographers Gallery, both of which are still important going concerns in the UK. So I think, honestly, I think it was less to do with the theorization, anthropological theorization of culture, than it was to think about a question of how to engage with the deployment of subculture and the way in which neoliberalism, as Stuart Hall and others came to define it, was engaged in a hegemonical cultural project. And, we spent an awful lot of time trying to sort of think back through 19th century's definitions of culture. But I don't think that was ever really the intent. The intent was much about engage with that contemporary politics of that time.
And the visual, of course, meant something very specific in that moment as well. And I know that the visual culture reader that you edited and that has been so kind of influential, there were two editions of that. One in 1903 now. So one in the first one was 1998, and then the second one 2002. And during that time,
2012.
Yeah.
I did, there were every 10 years until I stopped.
And so, my question, I guess, was what, because each edition you have changed quite substantially, what the meaning of visual and what that references in terms of contemporary culture has changed quite a lot, even between the first and the second two editions. What do you, as you reflect back on that now, what have been the kind of key changes in what is denoted by the visual over that period?
I mean, this is literally a book, but to be brief, the very first sentence that I published on visual culture in the introduction to Visual Culture Reader back in 1999 was "Modern life is lived on screen." Well, here we are on screen, are we not? And screens are now ubiquitous in ways that, obviously, to be fair, I couldn't have anticipated and didn't quite intend in 1999. But that, I think, is then obviously the signal difference between now and then, which is the massive transformation that has been implicated in the decentering of visual images of all kinds and their centrality to contemporary capital and to the practices of surveillance and to the practices of racialized distinction and discrimination that continue. So there's been a substantial shift, immense quantitative shift on the one hand. I mean, that we now, Americans, for example, take more photographs every 2 minutes than were taken in the entire 19th century. And that's a reputable field of study, right? 19th century photography. We're not going to make fields of study out of the last 2 minutes of photography, but you could. The 400 hours of YouTube go up every minute. And so there's, we are now then, if there was ever a possibility, which I don't think there ever seriously was, to do something called a history of images, some of which was talked about back then, it makes no sense now because it's simply unknowable to an extent. What you need are critical approaches and ways to connect and to intersect through particular image practices. So the final thing I'd say is that I think I am much less concerned now with the politics of representation. That was the central concern, I think, in the 90s about forms of imaging in relation to ethnicity, gender, histories, and so on, and much more about practices. That I think culture is a practice, and I think that the ways in which I'm thinking about now, so the encounter between people and machines, between people and media, and increasingly now between machines and machines, as mediated through visualized media.
And I think it's interesting that you sort of mentioned that opening line of the visual visual culture reader, which always appears as, I guess, not prophetic, but as a provocation, which visual culture has always been about. I think, you used earlier the phrase that visual culture is not a discipline, but a tactic. And more recently, you've spoken of visual activism. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you mean by that phrase.
Right. And visual activism is a practice that precedes my use of it, and I want to acknowledge that. I think the person that I became aware of it first, the person who first used it, as far as I know, although there's lots of people who claim it, was the South African photographer Zanele Maholi. And they came to give a keynote at the International Study Visual Culture Association in San Francisco in 2014. And it was very motivating for, I think, everybody who was there. And the whole conference was on the theme of visual activism. And there was a subsequent edition of the Journal of Visual Culture. And that just suddenly catalyzed for me, or crystallized, oh, you know what, I think this is what I've been doing all along. And this seemed like the much more appropriate name for it. And this is particularly so, I think, in the case, of the wave of activism that began with Arab Spring, which was highly visually mediated, and then through Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and in both of its iterations in 2014, 16, in 2020, that clearly now there's a very engaged and critical moment of thinking about how to activate the visible and how to counter some of the far-right tactics that center around that area.
And you've always written, of course, that the visuality is always a field of contestation, and in different moments in time, visuality can function as a force of authority or as a site of resistance. I wonder where you think we sit today. And I guess also more broadly, how optimistic do you feel about the possibilities of resistance and of using visuality as a tactic of resistance?
Sure. I mean, look, visuality is actually never our tactic. It's always the tactic of colonialism. So visuality is the way that they look at us. It's the top-down dominant viewpoint, the idea of the great man and all of that. But visuality is always contested by a counter-visuality. And I think that was hard. When I first read about that in 2011, that book came out just before all of those social movements that I just described. It was hard in some ways to conceive of that under what had seemed like a blanket imperial neoliberalism. Margaret Thatcher had famously said there is no alternative. And there were times at which it almost seemed as if that was true. And I think that was part of the reason we spent so much time thinking on politics of representation, because practical politics seemed so, it weakened and diminished at that time. So almost as soon as that book came out, then we started to see new ways of actually making counter-visualities. And also to try and think now past visuality altogether, rather than saying we're always countering what they do. What would another mode of visualizing look like that isn't dominated by colonial and imperial and racializing tactics of visibility? As fact, people often ask me about this optimism, pessimism question. And I think, Stuart Hall always used to say that you bring pessimism of the intellect and you combine that with optimism of the will. I think that's always a good tactic. Rebecca Solnit says you earn your optimism, you work at it. It's not a state of mind. It's a result of the work that you put in, as opposed to just an attitude that one develops. So to that extent, I think right now, if we were to put this in Gramscian terms, I would say that under neoliberalism, we were in a long war position, which is like a siege, where everything's very slow, very difficult, but a great deal's at stake in that. And then since the financial crisis of 2008, but it's only become really visible, I think, since the pandemic, we're now in a war of movement where things happen very fast, and that can appear very dramatic in the short term, but in the medium and long term, it seems less so. It's really hard to know right now, in other words, where we stand. And I think that's where I think analysis and critical engagement can really serve a purpose in trying to get a sense of precisely those kinds of questions.
And I guess as a way to perhaps segue into your talk today, I wanted to ask in particular about the impacts that the Black Lives Matter movement had on your work as a thinker and as an activist. I know that you've written that you attended your first Black Lives Matter protest in August 2014, which is now amazingly almost 10 years ago. But yeah, how did that moment change the way you think about writing and in particular being, I guess, a scholar and a critic?
I mean, there are two books that respond to that question, but the short answer is I think it changes everything in some way. And I think we have to be very honest about this. And if you look back at some of the work that was written by myself and others in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a little residual liberalism left there, in the sense that I think we thought that these things, white supremacy, monuments, reactionary museums, all the things that we've been dealing with since 2020 very actively, were withering away, that you didn't have to push, that the time would take care of this, that there were these unfortunate remnants that needed to be dealt with. There was police violence or the mass incarceration. These were enormous problems, but somehow the sense was that there was an underlying tide of progress that would see these things through. And I think what has become very visible to people who are white presenting and white identified since 2014, and I think our Black, brown, and Indigenous brothers and sisters were there before us, is that that's not inevitable at all. And that, in fact, we're now engaged in a very active moment of struggle around questions of racialization and questions of white supremacy in ways that I think we would have seen as being most unlikely. The whiteness studies that began in the 1990s had as its primary goal to make whiteness visible. Well, I think that's been very significantly and substantially achieved, but not in a good way. And it hadn't had the result that scholars in that time thought it would, which is if you sort of root it out and make it made apparent what it's doing, that people will look at it and go, oh, this is terrible, we shouldn't do that. Almost exactly the reverse has happened, hasn't it? That there's been this kind of gleeful attempt to capitalize and to mobilize. So Black Lives Matter has been an exercise in humility, I think, and to those of us who had great optimism in a sort of untrammeled kind of way earlier, perhaps in the 90s and early 2000s, to realize that this is a long struggle. And as Angela Davis has put it, freedom is a constant struggle, and that one has to position oneself appropriately and acknowledge the struggles that have gone before us in the way that you did at the beginning of your talk, by acknowledging the land on which you're sitting. And I will do the same when it's my turn to begin. And I think all of these things are for the better. I think we're in a much better place to make the kinds of assessments that we need and to build the kind of allyships and accompliceships that are needed. We've learned an enormous amount from Black Lives Matter, and it continues, I think, to be the central critical interface of our time. Well, on that note, I'll hand to you to begin your lecture, but I wanted to thank you for being here and also for answering all my questions. And we'll have time for further questions from the audience after your talk. So please, if you're tuning in, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions. Over to you then, Nick. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening, this morning, where you are, this evening where I am. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I only regret not being there in person, but hopefully at some point in the future, that'll again be possible. As I mentioned just a moment ago, let me acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape people, the indigenous peoples of these islands, and that there has been a long history of dispossession here, beginning in the 17th century. The Lenni Lenape people were largely driven out and dispossessed, but have not forgotten or abandoned their connections to the island of Manhattan, where I now am. And I work in the vicinity of Washington Square, which was in the 17th century turned into a farming area known to the Dutch, who were then the colonists, as land of the blacks, because half-free Africans were used to farm this area to supply food to the white colony downtown. And the boundary there was Wall Street. And Wall Street is known as that because there was a wall there built by enslaved African labor to keep out indigenous warriors and other people. So there's a deep layering in thinking through acknowledgement. And I'll return to this later in the presentation that I'm going to share with you this evening. What I want to do tonight is to share some ideas that came up in my new book, as was mentioned earlier on, White Side, and think about how we might strike against those practices. So I'm going to share my screen. So the artwork here is by Claire Fontaine, who are an art collective based in Palermo, with whom I've been collaborating on this project, which is their slogan, "When women strike, the world stops." And my title is essentially the takeaway. So if some of you have been asked to come here because of you're in a class or because you're just looking to say, what is the takeaway idea? It's my title. The Strike Against White Side is a feminist strike. And we will return to that idea repeatedly through the course of this conversation. I'm just going to say that given the alienating technologies of Zoom, it seems to me that what the worst thing one can do is to, in addition, read a talk over the internet for you to watch me on screen doing it. So it's so limiting in terms of the contact. So I prefer to just speak around the work and to talk more informally. I want to begin by acknowledging that whiteness is not an entity. It's not a thing. It's not a characteristic of particular bodies. To adapt the feminist Simone de Beauvoir, I would like to say we're not born, but rather become white, something that's taught to us, something that is inculcated structurally amongst people. It's learned young, certainly, but it can therefore, I would say, be unlearned. And that is the tactic that I'm hoping to engage in here today. It follows from that, and it's important to me to stress this, that in talking about whiteness and in asking for a strike against it, the affect that I'm trying to convey is not one of guilt or shaming of anybody who is white identified, but rather to say, let's remember, as we were just discussing a moment ago, the responsibility that we took on in 2020, at least in North America. For those of us that marched in that year in support of Black Lives Matter, attended a Zoom, followed matters on social media, and so on, at some point, someone said there, undermining and unbuilding white supremacy is primarily the work of people who are themselves white identified. And that's the work then that I'm asking us to carry on today as a mode of responsibility, and thinking about this then as a system and as a network, rather than as a characteristic of human bodies. Again, here, just to use myself as an example, when I grew up in the UK, I was obviously white, but not wholly so. And this would always be marked by a question to me, where are you really from? So my last name and my appearance were taken to be evidence that I wasn't properly, fully English. So it was white, but not quite English. When I arrived in the United States, however, in the 1990s, it took me a while to fully appreciate this. I gained all the privileges of white supremacy, whether I wanted them or not. That the color line here is rigid and operates in very schematic ways. Nothing had changed for me personally, other than that I had moved from one social system to another. So whiteness then is an attribute of social organization rather than of individual bodies and persons. So that's why I'm calling for us to strike against it, because if there's a social system or an organization, one can organize a strike against it. This is a different kind of strike than the traditional labor strike, though. It's the strike that is theorized in the feminist movement as the feminist general strike, which is to say that it envisages a completely different way of social organization. And it is not simply about the withdrawal of labor, because that's harder to do in this context. It's more about thinking about practices of refusal, practices of removal and repair, as I'll talk about later, and finding different ways to create the possibility of strike. For the Spanish feminist collective Precarias a la Deriva, finding your strike is the first responsibility in engaging in it. The strike, says the Argentinian feminist activist Veronica Gargal, is precisely a lens that makes it possible to see racializing hierarchy in this instance. In my mind, then, white sight is an operating system, and it connects then these different sets of assumptions, concepts, infrastructures, learned experience, symbols, and so on, that form together and actually experience white reality that is nonetheless not equivalent to, as it were, what there really is. The gap between white reality and actual experience is always closed by violence. When I think of it as an operating system, I mean to say not that I'm taking a 21st century parallel and projecting it back, but rather that the very concept of an operating system as it's come to be is a consequence of 500 years of settler colonialism and white supremacy that requires that kind of organizing network to function. I'm going to begin by outlining 3 modalities of white sight. I'll speak about the infrastructures that support it, and then I'm going to spend some time outlining possibilities for striking against it, and then we can obviously go to discussion. I know there'll be a great deal to say. I'm going to start by thinking about the relationship of perspective and projection. In the 17th century, theories of perspective combined, on the one hand, a projection of white reality onto bodies, as here, you can see that the artist drawing the perspective is looking out towards the naked female body of which he is taking possession by looking at her. This is some 300 years then, before Laura Mulvey, but this is nonetheless the male gaze in action. This particular form of vision imagines that sight projects rays out onto what it is that is to be seen, and then combined with a form of perspective. This projection is how colonization also came to visualize itself. And famously in Stradano's Discovery of America, the colonizer, in this case Amerigo Vespucci, is standing next to the naked figure of America, of whom he is taking possession by looking at her, but also the implication is very clear that this is a sexualized possession. In short, then, that colonization is, as the indigenous scholar Susan Deer has put it, always a question of rape and its metaphors. Boss then combines this projection with perspective. This is a drawing that you'll see in almost every visual culture textbook, but we never talked about it in terms of actual contemporary practice. We talked about it in terms of those little lines. But if you actually see what's going on here, 3 soldiers in uniform carrying swords are claiming and taking possession of space. The space they're claiming is erased by their looking, and it becomes measurable and real. As you can see, the little numbers A, B, C, D. It turns then into what in the United States is called real estate. In the language of colonialism, terra nullius, nothing land, land that can be claimed regardless of what or who was there before. So white sight is a combination of these 2 tactics of projection and perspective. That's its theory. In its applied form, it was practiced on the plantation in European colonies by a man who had the appropriate name of the overseer. I'm showing you here, there's a little underline, the white figure standing in the middle of the picture space. This is a plantation in which there are 14 different tasks being conducted to produce the blue dye indigo, which is what makes our genes blue. So we still live in a world that derives from this kind of practice. And it is simply by his surveillance of those at work that this labor is, at least in the theory of it, being carried out. You'll notice he's carrying a heavy stick, which will be used to close the gap by means of violence. And of course, all slavery and colonization was nothing if not spectacularly violent. In the imperial moment of the 19th and early 20th centuries, this question of perspective became projected onto an imperial screen. And I mean this quite literally. In the wake of the First Indian War of Independence in 1857, still known to the British as the Indian Mutiny, there was a great deal of disquiet in Britain as to why the Indians had revolted against their rule. And part of the sense of how to control this was to create a new form of visualizing. The art critic John Ruskin told his art students in his perspective, published in 1859, that what he wanted them to do was to imagine an immense sheet of glass, a mile wide and a mile high, between them and whatever it is that they wanted to draw. And onto this giant sheet of glass, then you will place this sight point that I'm showing you on the left-hand side of the slide here. And you can see that circle in the middle that looks much more accurately like a rifle sight than it does like a traditional perspective drawing. And that's precisely what the imperial screen enabled. It enabled the distinction between those on one side of the screen, the lookers, and those on the other side who are being looked at, or more accurately, being targeted. And this enabled the spectacular massacres of imperial cultures. This idea might seem quaint or bizarre in certain ways, and indeed, of course, it is, but it has not been forgotten. Whitesight has what I call a cultural unconscious, which, like all forms of the unconscious, does not forget. It stores and retains all the different types, stereotypes, and figures that made up its modalities. And so it came as a surprise to some when Donald Trump suggested that the border wall that was going to be built between the United States and Mexico needed to be transparent. But in some way, Trump was remembering this earlier cultural stereotype. Not that I'm suggesting that he had read John Ruskin or anything like that, but that he was aware at an intuitive level of the cultural unconscious of whiteness, and it made sense to people who subscribed to that worldview that he claimed this. Today, our imperial screens are radically decentered, of course. They are ubiquitous in form of closed-circuit television, of our phones, which provide an enormous amount of information to those who want to know about where we are and what we do, and through the monitoring of uncrewed aerial vehicles or drones. And this automated white sight, as I call it, combines then the two previous forms of white sight. It uses perspective in combination with projection by the means of a screen in digitally automated fashion. So just to give you a quick example of that, with which you will, of course, be familiar, the uncrewed aerial vehicle, as it was first imagined by the Israeli Defense Force in 1982, takes a viewpoint high above, looks down on the ground, and creates rectangles that can be seen and controlled by the drone. If you've not made the association already, it's essentially the same practice as that imagined by Abraham Boss some 200 years previously, but with a difference, the supplement being that in between the viewer and what it is that's being looked at is a great deal of distance and a screen. So these two people here are operating drones. They're sitting in a trailer that's in somewhere like Utah or Nevada, and they're flying the drones in Iraq or Yemen or Afghanistan. And you can see that they have a joystick to do that. The pilot on the left has replaced his joystick with a gamer stick so that he can make it a little more responsive. But this then is a highly distanced form of viewing, and a more perhaps lethal one, because that box on the ground, which I mentioned before as being the space in which the colonizer erases everything that was there or anyone who was there, has now a name in the military context. It's called the kill box. And the kill box is exactly what it sounds like. If you can see something in the kill box, you have legal permission to kill it. And the kill box in this instance can be limited by height, so that your own planes can safely fly above it. There's a bureaucracy to this. You can download the manual that the US Army circulates. Forms have to be filled out. It's really quite a remarkable process. This set of practices of Whiteside is not then simply practiced by individuals, but it's supported by a substantive infrastructure, and it has a variety of forms. The statue is perhaps the most obvious one, which I'm going to speak about here, but also museums, borders, of which you in Australia will know a great deal. And as I already mentioned, the cultural unconscious. Each of these forms chapters in the book. I won't have time here to outline all of them. I'm going to spend some time on the question of the statue because it's taken such a prominent place in recent visual activism since the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015. And the reason for that is that decolonizing as a practice had always understood the importance of the statue as an infrastructure of contemporary Whiteside. Frantz Fanon in 1961 said in The Wretched of the Earth that colonialism is a world of statues. And he was not being metaphorical. As we know, decolonization is not a metaphor. He went on to speak about the nature of the kind of statues you could see in colonial Algeria. And it was indeed a focus of the victorious Algerian Revolution on the first day that they took power in July of 1962 to remove French colonial statues from public spaces. As that wave of decolonizing and removing statues spread down Africa, in 1975, freedom fighters in Angola and in Mozambique removed statues even as the fighting was continuing going on. It was that important to their understanding of what decolonizing meant. Ran into the wall that was apartheid, and that took some time to be overcome. The liberation movement, as it were, gave the new government time, some 20 years in fact, to undertake that kind of work. And then the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015 begins that again, and it crossed the Atlantic and has circulated around the world from there. But I want to take us back to the beginnings of the colonial statue and to think about why it was so important and played such a significant role. And I'm showing you a statue here that's in the Italian coastal port of Livorno on the western coast of Tuscany. It was built as an ideal city by the Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando de' Medici, as you can see here, standing on his white pedestal. He's looking out to sea. Can't tell that from the photograph, but the sea is just off the edge here. And he's doing so precisely because he had hoped that Livorno would become a colonial city, trading with the Americas, and that Tuscany would become in itself an imperial power. Now, this statue, when it was completed in 1602, was just left at the side of the square because nobody really liked it that way. It was only when in 1626, the sculptor Ferdinando di Tacca had the idea of attaching to the base 4 chained Africans that the statue came on to take the resonance that Ferdinando had really wanted. So around the base are these larger than life-sized figures who were based on the life. There's a prison to the right-hand side here called the Bagno, where enslaved Africans lived and worked, and they are recognizable humans. What I want us to do, every time you see one of these white colonizers on a pedestal, is to imagine that attached to the base are Black, brown, or indigenous people from whom labor and value is being extracted in order to create the possibility of colonial dominance in the way that we have become accustomed to it. The symbol has condensed over the years, as symbols will do, but it has not been forgotten. It continues to circulate in the cultural unconscious, as I mentioned before. Here's a work by the British artist Mukhtar Dal, imposing the then Home Secretary Priti Patel onto Tacca's monument because she was the creator of the Anti-Refugee Nationalities Bill. Now, this artwork makes sense even if you're not familiar with the 17th century Italian sculpture, because we understand, as it were, instinctively, because we have been taught and learned these matters, the way that statues represent colonization. The statue further is itself the racial type. There's particularly the statue that known to art historians as the Apollo Belvedere, a Roman copy of a Greek original that comes to stand for the perfection of a white type of human that's distinct and separate as a species from any other form of human. In the immediate aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, natural history texts like the one that I'm showing you here on the left created the idea that whiteness could be represented directly by the Apollo Belvedere, not by a person, but by the Apollo. Beneath Apollo was a caricature of an African, which is so racist that I've removed it. And below that, as you may not be able to recognize, that's actually supposed to be a drawing of an orangutan. This is not an evolutionary hierarchy as we might read it. It's supposed to designate entirely separate species. And again, you may think that an idea like that, so outlandish, so strange, would have disappeared from contemporary life, but it resurfaces in the United States in 2015, and the Trump campaign with posters like this one I'm showing you on the right here, produced by a far-right group called Identity Europa, using the head of the Apollo Belvedere with a slogan that appears to be taken from the musical Cabaret, "Our future belongs to us." Us here always meaning white people. In fact, in the United States in particular, the figure of Apollo had actually been replaced in the late 19th century with the figure of Robert E. Lee, who was described by the former president of the Confederacy as the highest type of manly beauty. Apollo is the highest type of divine beauty. And therefore, it is no coincidence that the first conflict over statues in the United States in 2017 centered around the statue of Robert E. Lee at Charlottesville, Virginia. And that continues to be a contested place right up till the present. So we have then white site in its various modalities. It has these infrastructures that support it. I go into considerable detail about these in the book, but I wanted to stress this evening possible strikes against white site that we can deploy or at least learn from in creating our refusal to go along with these practices. Together then, once we have found a strike, the strike will help us to become something other than we are. And that we here is perhaps could be read as white people, but it can be read in whichever way makes sense to you. It's not given by Clairefontaine's text, but importantly, it's not something other than I am. It's not a singular person, or we're not asking individuals to change. The point is to find a different collective way of being. To me, this is absolutely central to the whole thing. The idea that Caribbean philosopher Edouard Glissant and my colleague Fred Moten have both circulated that what's vital is to consent not to be a single being. That monolithic figure of whiteness represented by the statue, but rather to think about how it might be possible to be together collectively. And crucially, I can't get past the word consent here, which plays such an important role in all forms of sexual and gender politics. I think too of the work of the suffragette movement, who were very aware of the idea of the imperial screen as representing colonial heteropatriarchy, and took to the streets in the first decade of the 20th century to break them. And this was very well organized. You would go to a venue, you would select a hammer that was decorated with suffragette slogans, and you would pick a window according to size. The larger the window you broke, the more jail time you would do. These windows were both in shops, but also in banks and especially museums. So even in the early 20th century, it was clear to the suffragettes that the imperial screen and the museum were directly connected. Now, our museum activism has not gone that far. We've hesitated to actually do physical damage. But if you see a work like this, and I want to call this an artwork by Margaret Gibb, which I'm calling Slashed Carlisle. Margaret Gibb was a suffragette who went into the National Portrait Gallery in London in 1914 and slashed the portrait by Millet of Thomas Carlyle. You might remember that in an earlier book, I described Carlyle as the author of the word visuality in English. He was profoundly racist and reactionary and believed in the idea that great men make history. So even if you don't know anything about Carlyle, you know that slogan, or at least you've seen the piles of biographies in bookstores and that idea that leaders matter and so on. Leaders who tend almost always to be white and tend to be male. So when Gibb was on trial, she said that in her view, the painting was now more interesting and more memorable than it had been previously. And I agree with that. I've gone to see it, not because I care about Millet's portrait of Carlyle, but because I'm interested in the performative artwork that Margaret Gibb made of it. So there's a challenge to us from a century ago, from the suffragette movement, that we need to think about. When we do take action, when we remove statues, we do something that I think is to tear white reality, that projection that stems back to the 17th century. Here in New Orleans, Louisiana, there was formerly a statue of Robert E. Lee on the top of this pedestal, which again stands on the waterfront looking out to sea in exactly the same way that Ferdinando de' Medici did in the 17th century. It was removed in 2017 and creates an almost palpably empty space on the top of that column. In 2021, the African-American sculptor Simone Lee was invited to fill that space. And she did it in this way. She created a statue called Sentinel or Mamiwata, Mamiwata being the syncretic Atlantic world deity created out of the intersection of African and indigenous religions around the Atlantic world. But she did not place it on the top of the pedestal. She places it, as you can see, on the ground, so that one could approach it eye to eye, face to face, have, as it were, a conversation with this statue and create a different form of relation between the statue and its spectators. And I want to think just briefly to conclude, how do we strike to see what comes after white sight? And this then addresses that question of optimism and pessimism that people have spoken about. The question to me is, where do we find some possibility of futurity? And I got to take my direction here from the artwork by Sabila Lee Smith that was shown in an exhibition called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, that was shown during the pandemic in 2020. It's about to reopen in New York at the beginning of May. And it's a video, a neon sculpture and a text-based piece. I want to concentrate on the bottom line here, where Smith says, blue in a decade where it finally means sky. And beneath that, you'll see a thin blue line of neon. Now, in American popular culture, the police represent themselves as the thin blue line. That was an idea they started circulating in the period of the civil rights movement, and it was very clear then and now what they mean by that, which is that on one side of the line are the criminal types, the dangerous people who are identified as Black, brown, and indigenous peoples, and on the other side are those that the police are protecting, white people. And this is absolutely explicit in the 1950s. It's become a learned rhetoric. But what if blue was to simply then mean the sky? What would we then see? In the sky, we would see birds, if nothing else. And one of the forms that I've taken from contemporary Black radical discourse is the idea of the murmuration as a way to consent not to be a single being. The murmuration is one of those assemblages of birds that form fractal patterns like the one I'm showing you here, often starlings, or to use the 17th century word, a stare. So the murmuration of stares is a different way to see together, to see how we might fly in formation with each other, how we might create movement with each other, how we might create different forms of social formation, and how then information results from that, but it's not the only reason to have a body, to be part of a social system. What the birds actually do here is they make a distinction between light and dark, or if you like, zeros and ones. And that's how they choose to fly. You either fly towards the body of another bird or towards the sky, light and dark. That digitization of movement doesn't result in linear patterns, though it results in these dramatically fluid and spectacular formations. Scientists don't really know why the birds do this. They have theories about how it's supposed to protect them from predators and so on, but there's no predator in this photograph. And when I've seen birds do it, there are often no predators nearby. My sense is they're doing it for fun. They're doing it for the sheer pleasure of it. They're doing it to create community, to extend their body into different forms of space. And I was able to understand this in a different context when I went to my first gallery show after the pandemic had shut everything down in New York, in Listen Gallery in New York. This is a film, 3-screen film by the Ghanaian British artist John Comfort, and it's called 5 Murmurations. And what was very striking to me about this film was that it dealt with all the issues that I've raised with you this morning in a series of layers. Comfort created images out of Renaissance painting, out of the Black Lives Matter movement, out of the lockdowns and conditions of social life in 2020, out of photographs of activist moments, for example, the famous photograph that was circulated after the death of Che Guevara. And he makes out of that then a different way of seeing. So when you look at this photograph and it may appear to be blurry, it's not as such. It's comprised of a series of layers of imaging. We don't photograph very well. So you actually have to kind of experience the actual projection in itself to really get a sense of what it's doing. And it will be touring again in the near future, I'm told. But interspersed between these scenes of contemporary social life are the possibilities of a different future, murmurations. And this is the gallery space in which it was being projected, so that you had these 3 screens and you could, as it were, feel yourself to be immersed in that murmuration and to imagine then that another world is visible. And on a good day, we can hear her breathing. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to just mention that if you're curious and you'd be interested to read the book, that if you use this coupon, read MIT 15, then you can get a discount. If you don't wish to do that or can't afford to, I do have this newsletter that's free every week called The Week in White Site, which you can get via the Substack app, and that's always free. And you can see the archived versions of that that are available. So thank you for listening this morning. I'm going to stop the share and let's see if maybe we can explore some of these questions in conversation.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I wanted to mention as well that an earlier book of yours, The Appearance of Black Lives Matter, is also available for free to download and is well worth reading. We have a few questions, and to give people a little more time to come up with questions, I thought I might start with one of my own. Looking at the audience members today, I know that a lot of us are coming from within the space of the university, both as students and as teachers and as researchers. And I wanted to ask you whether you think the university as an institution and as an Enlightenment institution has a particular role to play in the strike against whitesight. And if so, what are the sorts of collective practices that can contribute to that? And I know in particular, for example, that new forms of collective syllabi is something that you've worked on in the past. But I'm wondering if you have other ideas or suggestions or practices that have worked.
That's an important question. I think these are questions that have to be answered locally, obviously, because the conditions vary and systems vary. Fred Moten and Stefano Hani have argued that we need to see the university as a refuge, as a place that we can use, that we can provide physical space for social movements. That's certainly been true in New York, that from Occupy on, social movements have used university buildings to hold meetings, to organize, to gather in, and so on. That's an important function. We can use the university as a direct space of contestation. So not speak about anybody else's university, but speak about mine. You mentioned earlier that the name of my school is Steinhardt, which is true. We're named after a man called Michael Steinhardt, who gave a not particularly large amount of money to NYU some 20 or so years ago. In recent months, it's emerged that Michael Steinhardt is, amongst other things, he's long been known to be accused of sexual harassment in very well-documented ways, but he's also an art looter. And he has traded in looted art and has been called out by the Manhattan District Attorney and told that he needs to return this art or face criminal charges, and has done that, including work that was in the Metropolitan Museum at the time. And some of that art had been looted by ISIS and purchased by him at these bargain basement rates. And so what we're trying to do is to get that name off our school, to not give this man the ability to circulate that name. And you will have seen the much more public example of this struggle led by Nan Goldin and the group Pain. And if you haven't seen this, I strongly recommend the new film by Laura Poitras called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, which describes the history of the Pain group, but also the work that Goldin did during the AIDS epidemic, which is very local here, of course, also, and her own history with the suicide of her sister because of her sexual rebellious background. So there are, again, layers upon layers there. We're trying then to divest the university. But then there are other ways in which universities need to strike. And I know that you've been on strike recently in Sydney. I did a strike meeting at Goldsmiths College over in March, and there have been all kinds of issues at stake there. So what I'm beginning to think about is what we were actually very substantially thinking about at the beginning of neoliberalism in the 1970s. And I know this was also true in Sydney, but it's definitely true in London, New York, Paris, and many other places, with how to have a different kind of educational practice, how a different kind of learning, which was not centered around the exchange of very large amounts of money, as it is in Britain and the United States now, where students are producing substantial amounts of debt. In fact, it's such that the largest form of consumer debt in the United States is now student debt. And this is ridiculous, but it also produces intentional effects that you have a huge amount of debt. You're more likely to take a job on Wall Street than you are to go and volunteer to work for a not-for-profit or something of that kind. So I think there are a range of possibilities, and it will just, it will depend on circumstances in which you find yourself, on which your university is. But the thing that I would say about university, in the same way that I say about museums, is that they are substantial physical spaces in cities that now are overpriced and unaffordable for many of us, and that those resources should not be given up lightly, that we should find ways to continue to use them for groups who don't have those kinds of resources and spaces.
Fantastic, and thank you. Yeah, and I think especially here in Australia, the important politics of place and who occupies those places and whose sovereignty remains in those places is always a pressing question. I'm going to turn now to the questions that we have from our audience. I'll note that we have a function turned on where you can upvote other people's questions. So I'll be using that to direct me to the most popular questions. And the first one is from an anonymous attendee saying, on the idea of museum activism, surely the climate activists are doing this work. And I guess that opens to the broader question of the most recent discourse around climate change and activism around that, which I know has been part of your work and something that has inflected the direction of your scholarship as well as your activism.
The work that climate activists are doing now in museums is very interesting in regard to, particularly, I think, the suffragette work that I was showing earlier on. If you think about the moment where people threw tomato soup at Van Gogh or at other artwork like that. They've always been very careful to say, we picked work that was covered in glass. We're not going to do any damage to the artwork. It's going to be fine. Don't worry, we're only making a point. Well, if we were to learn from our suffragette forebears, they should have damaged it in order to really make the point. And this is something that climate activists themselves are saying. So Andreas Malm, who wrote an important text called Fossil Capital, which is a very dense analytic text about the relationship of fossil fuels and capitalism. His next book is much more simply titled How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And what Malm believes is that we need to take direct action against the infrastructure of fossil fuel capitalism now. And indeed, today we have seen that the oceans have risen to the highest temperature ever, and that scientists are really worried about this because then oceans are actually supposed to be cooling off now. This is usually the point of the day of the cycle in which they cool off. So we face an unprecedented moment. I commend anybody that's willing to put themselves in harm's way in the way that the climate activists did. I would, to the point raised by the questioner, I would say we all owe an enormous debt to environmental activists. I mean, they were the people, through Earth First and so on in the 1970s, who really brought direct action into the public eye. People like the tree sitters who literally sat in trees that were about to be cut down by foresters, and that takes guts, and that takes organization, and that takes commitment, and they've really been at the forefront of many of these questions. So I don't think in any way it's either or, but a both and. I think, yes, absolutely, we absolutely cannot not be engaged in climate activism. And finally, I mean, I didn't stress this in this presentation because there's only so many things that one can say in a limited amount of time. But extractive capitalism is always about environmental devastation. It has never not been. The island of Barbados became deforested in 1660 because of the relentless transformation of the land into plantations for the growing of sugar. And that little island became the largest source of wealth in the British Empire at that time. And you see a series of islands to this. The first is Madeira, that became the largest source of wealth for the Portuguese Empire. Barbados becomes the largest source of wealth for the British Empire, and then Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti, in turn for the French Empire. Each of these islands, in turn, though, finds itself environmentally devastated, and that has become very visible in the case of Haiti to the present day. The flooding and so on that results from hurricanes is largely due to the deforestation that goes back to the plantation period. So these are in no way unconnected issues, and it's simply for the coherence of a short presentation that I didn't stress that this evening.
To pick up perhaps another genealogical thread of the strike against white site, one questioner, Nicholas Orr, an art historian who's at the University of Newcastle, asks, why did the Black Panthers and the other Black radicals in the US in the 1960s not counterattack statues? It surprises me, given the importance the practice had in Fanon's thought and African freedom fighters' practice, and the interests that the Panthers had in both of these.
That's a very good question, Nicholas, and I can't give you off the top of my head answer to that one. I think we'll have to go and ask them to an extent. I mean, Catherine Cleaver is still around, and we should look in their archive. I suspect the answer is that they were interested in taking more direct forms of action at that time, and believed in the possibilities of revolutionary transformation. Interestingly, in relation to this, the Film Forum, which is the cinema just around the corner from me here, that's been in the village since the 60s, was where the Battle of Algiers was shown in constant rotation. And Catherine Cleaver told me that the Panthers used to go down there and watch it over and over again in the idea of following revolutionary tactics. Now, there's no statue destroying in the Battle of Algiers because the film precedes the takeover, and the film ends with that moment of the woman dancing. And many have argued that Pontecorvo was trying to signal that there was already an issue with gender divides and that things were not panning out in the way that the revolutionaries had hoped. But here's this is an intriguing question, and there is a long lag in this statue activism. It transfers, if you like, in 2015, and one of the things that I suggest that happens at that moment is in Charlottesville, Virginia, in June of 2015, the visual activist Naila Maholi actually had an exhibit, and they visited, and they gave a public lecture, and they spoke about their work and the importance of visual activism and what had happened recently in South Africa with Rhodes Must Fall. On the day that their exhibition came down in June 30th of 2015, that's the first day that somebody in Charlottesville decided to tag the statue Robert E. Lee with Black Lives Matter. And up until that point, the first wave of Black Lives Matter hadn't really been interested in statues either. There hadn't been any particular focus on it. And then even then it remains a local issue. The Charlottesville City Council takes an approach, and they decide that they're going to consult, and it takes time. And over the course of 2016, they come to a decision to remove it. And that's when the far right intervene and make the whole thing very much more visible. So it's always difficult to answer a negative question, but I think this one actually is a great question. I'd love to think some more about the reasons for that. So thank you very much for raising it.
We have another question from Annie Murney, who's an art historian and critic at Uni New South Wales. And he asks, thanks for the stimulating lecture, Nick. I'm interested to know your position on divesting from vision / visuality and engaging the other senses as resistance, a multisensory practice.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. So now my sense of this is evolving in this, that I think that white sight is actually very centered on the visual. In fact, almost to the exclusion of other senses. We had a very practical and very nasty demonstration of this just in the United States within the last week or so. A young man called Ralph Yarl, 16-year-old, was asked by his mother to go and pick up his siblings in Kansas City, Missouri. And he mistook the address, and he ended up knocking on the right number in the wrong street. And it turned out the man who lived there was an old white man who had a glass door, and he sees Ralph Yarl, who's a black teenager, through the door, and without asking him anything, without saying anything to him, he shot at him. Luckily, he's not a great shot, so even at close range, he only injured the young man. But that gave me a sense of, it's a practical, real-life sense of when it's all about sight. It's all about that encounter. And therefore, then, the attempt to strike against white sight will, of course, want to involve all manners of sensory perception. I think, both scientifically and intuitively at level of practice and performance, we know that there's no real distinction to be made amongst the senses, that they interact and they combine as all bodily systems and circuits do. We've seen scholars like Tina Kant think about innovative new ways to listen to images, to imagine their frequency, as she puts it, and to draw on that alternative way of engaging with visual materials. So I'm all for that. And I think, in this case, what I'm doing here is, staying in my lane and engaging with these dominant practices of white sight that I do think is especially concerned with making people visible. Again, our closed circuit television cameras, our drones provide visual images, but don't attend to the auditory, let alone the tactile or the olfactory. And finally, I'll say this, which is one of the reasons that the Rhodes Must Fall movement was the success that it was not visual, but actually olfactory. And this is because the first action that was done by a group of students who lived in Khayelitsha, which is a large township on the edge of Cape Town. About 1 million people lived, and 99% Black South African. And even in the present moment, most of the people who live there don't have access to indoor plumbing. And because the place is not safe at night, people collect human waste in boxes that are then emptied by the local authorities. And so they brought human waste in one of these boxes to the campus. And knowing that the police would be likely to stop them because they're a group of visibly Black students approaching the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, they dressed up as performance artists because it was the opening day of a performance art festival in Cape Town. And they were able to get up to the statue as a result, and they threw this human waste onto the statue. And I think, as it were, broke its aura of dominating white sight. I don't know if you visited the place where the statue was, but it's a spectacular sight. I mean, there's mountains behind, and the coast rolls away from you. On a clear day, you can see the sea from up there. It's a beautiful, spectacular spot. But to have that powerful smell of human waste sort of break that spell for a moment, I think actually kind of woke people up, and they looked at this statue and thought, hang on, apartheid ended 20 years ago. What is this thing doing here? This is ridiculous. And so within a month, it was gone, you know, as recently as the previous October, that was in March, the previous October, the university said, no, we're not at all interested in removing this statue. So that gives you, I think, a sense of a practical way in which, using a kind of multisensory approach, was able to get a result in a way that simply being counter-visual might not have been so successful.
And the idea of using performance art as a sort of a camouflage for direct action is quite a powerful metaphor in its own right, and speaks volumes about the history of the avant-garde and its relation to political action. I think that a performance artist would be more acceptable in its approach to such a statue than a citizen, perhaps, or an individual.
A little footnote to that, which is, I think people will probably know the performance conducted by Sethembili Mizani when the statue of Cecil John Rhodes was removed. She did a 4-hour-long durational performance as the Great Bird of Zimbabwe. She stood with her arms out for the entirety of that period in a costume to evoke the Great Bird. And if you look carefully in the photographs, at the moment that the statue is removed, she is literally the only person in the entire space not taking a photograph. And it, as it were, then by putting her body in that space, she creates this counter to Cecil John Rhodes that wins in that moment by driving him out of the space. And it is, if you like, she becomes a commemoration that overcomes the individual white figure.
Amazing also to think of contemporary art as a resource for exactly such strategies. I have a question from Heather Content, also at University of New South Wales, critic and art historian. She asks, what are your thoughts about a reclamation, if you will, of some of these white site practices as a strike tactic? In particular, I'm thinking about counter-surveillance and surveillance practices that have in the past used the imaging practices of the overseer to monitor those who oversee.
Absolutely, Heather. Thank you for that question. I think that the presence of the undercommons, the seeing from below, surveillance, also what I now call surrealism. I'm interested in a way in which we had a surrealism, but I think what emerges from below is a different kind of realism. And I'm going to say surrealist writer Suzanne Césaire spoke in her 1941 essay of freedom as an abyss, as what she called that other abyss. In other words, there's the abyss of the Atlantic Ocean in which many thousands died, but there's also then this place which freedom comes up from below, and this then creates what I call this surrealism. Surveillance as a counter is, of course, there's a long history of counter surveillance, and Laura Poitras has been deeply engaged in work like that in Citizen4 and in other fields. I think we're at a point where the surveillance is so saturating that it's actually now it's almost at a point where it's redundant, in the sense that there's so much of it that they don't know what to do with it. We had a very good practical example of this in New York a few months ago, where there was a shooting on the subway. Someone came down and deliberately opened fire in a subway, and immediately people said, where's the CCTV? And it turned out, they said, well, this camera was broken at the station. I think actually they're mostly broken. I think they mostly don't work. So we might think, what if one was to, in the language of the social justice movements, to act as if we are not under surveillance, to act as if we are already free. So that the tactic used by the Occupy Hong Kong or Occupy Central movement in 2019-20 was, before beginning an action, to go up on a ladder and spray paint the CCTV so that they couldn't then be recognized using facial recognition technology. In New York, at least, that's not possible. I mean, the CCTV is absolutely everywhere. We used to have here, when I first moved here a while ago now, there used to be a group called the Surveillance Camera Players, and they did exactly what you're talking about. They would take people on tours to show them where the CCTVs were and what they did and who they reported to. Now, if I were to do a similar tour, which I could, I wouldn't get off my street by the time that people were fed up with listening to how many CCTV cameras there were. So this, I think, this is the sense I mentioned before, that I think we need to find, thoroughgoing alternatives. And one of those, practices has been to always, Black Lives Matter has exemplified this, is to not do things, as it were, clandestinely, but to do them as openly as possible, to make it very, very clear where you are, what you're doing, and where you're going, in such a sense that it cannot be denied. And I think we've seen that in a variety of recent social practices. So thank you for that question. There's a lot to think about there.
Thank you. And we have a question from Mackenzie Smith, who asks, I get the impression that you see something distinctly visual about individuation and its relationship with racial subjugation. And I wonder if you could elaborate on this. I'm also wondering whether the murmuration in its visual register can sustain a shift in thinking, or if the problem is the individual seeing subject.
Mackenzie, that's a great question again, and there's much to think on here. I do think that there is the practice of overseeing, the practice of placing a person under specific surveillance, such that after the abolition of slavery, French planters spoke nostalgically about what they called the magic that they used to have, that they could sleep, 3 or 4 of them, hundreds of enslaved Africans would continue working around them under the illusion that they were being watched. So that there's something tremendously powerful about that work. And it's achieved, as it were, its paranoid form in that moment that I just described, where Ralph Yarl is shot for nothing other than knocking on the wrong door. That as soon as he is seen, he's identified as a threat. And so previously, I've often spoken about the whole dynamic of the social justice and anti-racist and abolition movements since Black Lives Matter surfaced in 2014 has been this moment where a police goes up to a person and they respond to them in a completely different way, according to whether they identify them as white or not. And in that moment, all these histories that I've been speaking about today are condensed and compressed, and it's an immediate judgment that's made on the behalf of that individual police. So that the police who murdered Michael Brown in 2014, most of his testimony when he appeared in front of a grand jury was taught to him by his lawyers. It was very careful. But there was one bit where I think he was actually speaking in his own voice, where he said, Michael Brown, who was an 18-year-old child, he had just finished high school, appeared to him to be a demon and like Hulk Hogan. And demon is Fanon says in The Wretched of the Earth that colonialism is a Manichaean way of organizing. That, in other words, you are either entirely good or you're entirely evil. And in this case, then the police produce that distinction that Brown is a demon. But then he's also this figure from popular culture, Hulk Hogan, who's a wrestler. He's actually white. He's a very large, very physical person. So these two images circulating in the cultural unconscious of that police officer surface and entitle him to reach for his gun. I do think I have optimism about murmuration, and I think that it stems from a long history of thinking about the collectivity of birds. And I would suggest here that we might have time in future to talk about the 12th century Sufi text, the Conference of Birds, which speaks at great length about the search that the birds go on to discover truth, and the way in which it's revealed to them at the end that they have to create it for themselves. And there's a lot of discussion along the way with the hoopoe, who is the leading bird. There's an immense archive of Western and non-Western art that depicts, you might say, the Conference of Birds. And in the book and elsewhere, I've spoken about the work of Aotearoa New Zealand artist Bill Hammond, who did these amazing paintings, imagining Aotearoa before humans arrived, because it was then a land dominated by birds. They were the largest and most dominant life form. There were no predators other than one eagle that was a predatory bird. And imagining then a very different form of sociality. The birds that he paints are not strictly birds. They are somewhere between the human and the bird. And he got the idea, he said, from visiting an island called Motuatua, which is being returned to its pre-contact state off the coast of South Island in Aotearoa, and observing there the penguins who all stood on the edge of the land, looking out to sea as if waiting for something. And my sense is that, perhaps in this instance, they're waiting for the end of the human regime. And that goes back to the moment that we spoke about in the relation to climate before, that it is very clear that either humans change our ways of practicing, or that there will be a crisis quite unlike anything that we've gone through before in recent human history. So that this does seem to me now not to be a matter of mysticism or of spirituality, although it is those things actually, but also a very urgent way to imagine a different kind of political collectivity. And you can find traces of this in the work of Saidiya Hartman, who's used the idea of the commemoration in her book, Wayward Lives. Fred Moten has spoken about it in the recent book with Stefano Hani called All Incomplete. There's a theme of jazz musicians working on the idea of the Conference of Birds. So there's a whole kind of dynamic, and I'm beginning to think this is my next project, actually, having spoken about this for a little while.
Well, I think that's quite a good note to end on then, as the prospective next book. We've reached 11:30 our time, which I'm conscious is quite late your time. We have one other question from Scott East, which was more of a statement, with a link to a clip of fractal behavior. And Scott notes that the point is really that simple rules allow complexity to emerge. I wonder, and he sort of further asks, what are the simple rules of striking together that allow new futures to emerge? If you have an answer to that one, that might be a nice note to end on.
That's a beautiful question. I think that there are a number of simple rules. Acknowledge the presence of those who came before us, right? Acknowledge that we need to learn, to follow, those of us that are identified as white, from those practices. We need to respect and learn from the simple slogan of the Standing Rock encampment in 2016, Maniwikoni, water is life. And that speaks to a number of the questions that have come up today. And that in the rules that were offered to non-Indigenous visitors to that camp, they ended with this simple statement: this is a ceremony, act accordingly. And that then places the burden on us to follow, to learn, to observe, and to act accordingly in this performative way that we've discussed in a couple of instances here. And I think that is a good rubric by which we might begin to create, in understanding that we respect the ancestors, that Black Lives Matter, that water is life, and that in this ceremony we act accordingly.
Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your work with us today. We hope to see you in Sydney perhaps sometime soon. But in the meantime, our audiences cannot applaud, but I will convey their applause to you. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks to everyone who came. And thanks for a beautiful set of questions that really got me thinking. A very rich conversation, as it were, has emerged. And as the other Nick has just said, let's hope that at some point in the not too distant future we can do it in person in Sydney. I really enjoyed that.